Um, so welcome everyone, welcome back to these important webinar session series of where we explore mindfulness and heartfulness in depth with pioneer teachers and scholars in the field. We've had Dr. John Kabat-Zinn kicking off the series for us, explaining the fundamentals of mindfulness. Then we had Dr. Willem Kijken from Oxford University explaining how mindfulness in the form of MBCT can be used to deal with depression and to reduce depression episodes. And last we had Dr. Saki Santorelli from UMass Medical School, where he spoke about the need for the mindfulness teachers to practice and for the mindfulness practice to arise out of love, with an echo of love and heart. And now I'm very happy, delighted to have in that line of thought to have Dr. Chris Germer with us to speak to us about self-compassion and mindfulness-based self-compassion today. Hi, Chris.
Hello, Amir.
Very welcome. And thank you for making time for us.
Thank you. Well, it's an honor to be speaking right now with everyone. I had the privilege in 1976 of being a tourist in Iran.
Yes.
And now to be able, this is my first time to return, although not properly yet. This is returning with the miracle of the internet. So
Yes.
I'm very grateful to you, Amir, for this series, and also to Manish for moderating for us in Tehran, and Chandu, who is our tech man in Australia. So we are really coordinating with 4 different subcontinents to be speaking.
Yes.
So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Before we go on, if you agree, we cover some housekeeping items, and then we move on to your so important subject of self-compassion. For the viewers, it's important to know that you'll be put on a mute mode throughout the session. However, you can send us your questions while Dr. Germer is speaking about self-compassion throughout the session. We make a note of your questions, and in the interest of the limited time we have, we will ask Chris the most important or relevant questions at the end of the sessions. And then this session is being recorded and being actually broadcasted live on Facebook. And we will have it at the end of the session. It will be there for you to go and view it throughout. So again, back to you, Chris. We know you are a psychotherapist. You teach and lecture at Harvard University, and you are the co-developer of mindfulness-based self-compassion with Christine Neff. And I hear that you and Christine Neff, you will be releasing a new workbook on self-compassion very soon, and that seems to be a book in demand nowadays. And I have been reading your book on self-compassion, the pathways to self-compassion. Reviewing it and reading it, it's just gives me such a feeling of how important this is in our life. Somehow, personally, um, when I'm reading your book, I feel this mindfulness that is without an element of self-compassion, a mindfulness that is not softened by self-compassion, would be a dry clinical thing without a heart. So to me, this is such an important topic to cover. And I'm happy you're here to talk to us about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Amir. Well, I appreciated Saki's expression that loving kindness and compassion should be echoing through our awareness, through mindfulness. And as you were talking about this, it's clear to me that it is echoing through your awareness. And so I appreciate your sensibility about this. So what I found in my own personal life is that sometimes when we are confronted with really difficult situations, really difficult emotions, that we need to be a little more explicit. We need to be on purpose practicing compassion and self-compassion, or else we cannot be mindful. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and as a clinical psychologist, all the time we're dealing with really difficult emotions, with shame, with despair, with dread, fear, intense emotions. And when that comes up, in order to be able to live within our own bodies and selves and also with others, we just need a lot of compassion. Rumi once said, close your eyes, fall in love, and stay there. And that's such a beautiful thing to say. However, sometimes when we close our eyes and we see something good and we fall in love, in other words, we have appreciation for the miracle of life, then difficult emotions often come in, like we might feel shame or despair or fear. And then we actually cannot stay in love because we feel other things. We feel disgust. We want to get away. In other words, we can't fall in love and stay there. So what does it take actually to stay there in our own experience? And that's self-compassion practice. I know right now in Iran that there are a lot of changes, a lot of uncertainty, politically, economically, and other things. And regrettably, I know the United States is largely responsible for that. I can say that here in the United States, we're also experiencing a lot of fear and dread, probably not quite at the same level as in Iran, but this is not a happy time for Americans either, I can tell you that. And it's a great struggle. It's a great struggle sometimes to remain compassionate toward oneself and toward others in these difficult times, because we do feel intense emotions. But I do think that self-compassion can help. In order to grow in compassion for others, we actually first need to grow in compassion for ourselves, which means we first need to be able to know what we're experiencing in a spacious way. That's mindfulness. We also need to be able to see that we're not alone. And so that's what we call common humanity, a sense of we're together and just like me. And then the third component, and then the third part is self-kindness. In other words, we actually need to learn to be as kind to ourselves as we would be toward others. So these are the three components of self-compassion that have been identified by Kristen Neff, who in 2003 began the scientific study of self-compassion. Self-compassion is not new. It's been with us as long as humanity has been here, but it is now more clearly understood as an inner resource, just like mindfulness, that allows us to be healthy mentally and physically and to thrive. And the three components that Kristen identified were, number one, the three components of self-compassion are mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness. So in this series, you've been learning a lot about mindfulness, which is kind of a loving moment-to-moment awareness, generous, spacious, moment-to-moment awareness, to be with things as they are in a steady way. So that's the first part of self-compassion, knowing when we're struggling. What's really important, though, is this element of self-kindness when it's hard to be mindful. And so an informal definition of self-compassion is treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding as we would treat a dear friend in the midst of suffering. So I'd like you just to think for a moment, just a mental reflection. When something goes wrong in a dear friend's life or someone you love, say they're suffering or they've failed or they feel inadequate, and you have just a few moments with this person, what do you feel inside when you discover they're struggling? What is your attitude? And what kind of words are you likely to say to your friend when they're suffering? So just take a moment to think about that. So I think you can get a feeling for that. And then the next question is, think of a time when you have failed, when you've suffered, when you feel inadequate, like something really didn't go wrong. Really didn't go right. How do you treat yourself? What kind of feelings emerge toward yourself? What kind of words do you say toward yourself? Even what is your posture, How do you sit when you have failed or when you're suffering? So take a moment to think about that. Okay. So probably you noticed there was a difference,
Yes.
And the vast majority of people are just so much kinder to other people when they are suffering than we are to ourselves when we suffer. So usually we beat up on ourselves, we feel alone, we feel ashamed, we distract ourselves. We can't take it when it's us, So self-compassion simply means being able to have that same attitude toward yourself as you do toward others when they're struggling. Now, this is not so easy to do. And the reason why it's not so easy to do is because we are so close to ourselves. In other words, we don't have space. When you're with a friend, you have a little space. But when we're with ourselves, there's no space. So we just react in a fearful way. So self-compassion really is a very humble undertaking, very humble. All we're doing is including ourselves in our circle of compassion in the same way we might treat a family member or a friend or a pet, any living creature that we're kind to treat ourselves in the same way. This is all we're doing. In other words, if we have a circle of compassion, to just slip ourselves in the corner, So some people think, oh, self-compassion, it's selfish. It's actually not selfish. Still, we will be always more compassionate toward others. But there are some obstacles to self-compassion. Some people think, oh, self-compassion will make me selfish, or it will make me lose motivation, or it will make me be absorbed in self-pity, or it will make me weak, or it will make me self-indulgent. So these are common myths about self-compassion, and the research shows that actually it's the opposite. And there are now 1,600 articles in the scientific literature on self-compassion. And self-compassion is over and over is demonstrated to be a very powerful factor for mental health, for physical health, for reduced anxiety, for reduced depression, for healthier habits, better relationships, even wisdom. People who are high in self-compassion are also high in wisdom. But more specifically, people who are high in self-compassion, they have emotional resilience. When things go wrong, they can bounce back more easily. They're also, when they make mistakes, they're more likely to admit their mistakes and work hard to fix them. In their relationships, people who are high in self-compassion are actually more compassionate to others. They're not more selfish, they are more compassionate to others. And most interestingly, people who are high in self-compassion, they are more motivated to achieve their goals in order to, in other words, their standards, people high in self-compassion, their standards is just as high as people low in self-compassion, but they have more motivation to reach their goals because they're motivating themselves with kindness. They're not beating on themselves with a stick, which reduces their motivation. They're motivating themselves with kindness. So self-compassion is a very, very good thing, even though we often worry that it isn't. And if you practice self-compassion, you will actually see how it will improve your life. So then the question is, how do I practice self-compassion? So many people think, oh, I need to meditate. And actually meditation helps. But meditation is just like if you want to strengthen your body, you might go to the gym and lift heavy weights, focusing on developing a skill, like the skill of mindfulness or the skill of self-compassion. But you can also practice self-compassion in daily life. And the way to do it is to ask yourself a question that you are likely to ask somebody whom you truly love. And that is the question, what do you need? When somebody's suffering, in your heart or out of your mouth will come the words, what do you need? What do you really need? When we're suffering, we don't ask ourselves that question. What do you need? But if we do ask the question and answer it from the heart and do that, we will be practicing self-compassion. But to just say, what do I need? People usually think, oh, I don't know what I need. But then we can break it down a little. So for example, if you're feeling afraid or fear, ask yourself, what do I need to feel safe? Or if you're physically under stress, you can say, what do I need to soothe myself? Like maybe I need to take a warm bath, or maybe I need to exercise. Or what do I need to comfort myself emotionally? Maybe you need to walk in nature, practice kindful resting, being in nature. Or maybe you need to listen to music to soothe yourself emotionally. As I said before, to comfort yourself emotionally or to soothe yourself physically. Another way to answer the question is, what do I need? Is what do I need to validate myself? In other words, maybe you need to say something like, oh, this is really hard. Maybe nobody has ever said that to you. Maybe you've never said that to yourself. So what do I need? What do I need to comfort myself, soothe myself, validate myself? But that's only half the picture. This is in the area of nurturing and nourishing. Sometimes we need to support ourselves to move into the world. And then you can say, what do I need to protect myself? Maybe we need to say no. That's often a very compassionate thing to do. Or to provide for myself. In other words, maybe I need to eat well or care for my body or sleep more. What do I need to provide for myself? And sometimes even what do I need to motivate myself? Sometimes the best thing we need to do is to get out and do something that we've been avoiding. How do we do that? So with self-compassion, we do that with encouragement. With self-compassion, we invite, we talk to ourselves in a kind way, like, you can do this. You definitely can do this. You've done things like this before. This is not easy, but you can do it. So what do I need? Behavioral self-compassion is the foundation of self-compassion. Actually, how are you accompanying yourself in your daily life? As a friend or as an enemy? We want to be a friend. This is self-compassion. Now, for those people who have a contemplative attitude or who like to meditate, there are many different meditations which you can get for free. You can download them from my website, www.chrisgermer.com. And also this new workbook has a lot of things. But what I'd like to do is just in 5 minutes, if I may, introduce you to a brief practice called the self-compassion break. And this is an exercise you can do anytime, day or night. And it consists of 3 components, the 3 components of self-compassion. It consists of mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness. Do we have 5 minutes to do this, Amir?
Yes, yes, by all means, yes, please.
Okay. And in daily life, you can also just do one of these components. You can just do the mindful part, or you can just do the common humanity part, or you can just do the self-kindness part. But what I will do now is give you an experience of using language to activate self-compassion within yourself. Okay? So to start, and if you're willing to do this, and really you can ask yourself, do I want to do this? You know, what do I need? Do I want to do this? And if the answer is no, don't do it. That's self-compassion. Just because I'm going to do this, that doesn't mean you have to do it. What do I need? You ask that question a lot and you will be more self-compassionate. Very simple. Okay, but if you want to do it, what I'd like you to do is to close your eyes for a moment and think of a problem that you are having in your life right now. So it could be a work problem, could be a family problem, could be a health problem. And when you think of a problem, think of one that's mild to moderate. In other words, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the worst, make it a 3. Just a little bit of a problem. But enough of a problem that when you think about it, you feel a little stress in your body. Okay? So please take a moment to think of such a problem in your life right now. And when you have a problem in your mind, again, please make it mild to moderate, not severe. When you have such a problem in your mind, please allow yourself to experience this problem in your mind and body. In other words, Who is there? Are there any words being said? What is the setting or the situation? Visualizing a room or a place. And you can even think of political or economic problems that might be happening around you, because when you read the news or hear the news, it breaks your heart. That's also a real problem. But I'd like you to bring it to mind enough that you can feel some uneasiness or distress in your body. Now, usually in daily life, these problems come to us without inviting, but now for this exercise, we are inviting. Feeling it in your body. And then saying to yourself, oh, this is a moment of suffering. This hurts. This is hard. What I am feeling now is difficult. This is painful. So this is mindfulness. This is knowing what we are feeling while we're feeling it. And this is also validating, just like you would for a friend. So, oh, this is so hard. This is really hard. This is painful. So just giving yourself permission to name that it hurts to have this problem, as you would for a friend. This is hard. Tenderly. This is hard. And notice what happens when you say that, when you name it. This is really tough. So that's part one, component number one, that's mindfulness. And then part two is, please, keeping your eyes closed, offering yourself the insight that struggle and suffering is a part of living. It's a part of everyone's life. Everyone struggles. When I struggle, I am not alone, even though it feels often like I'm alone. Other people would feel just like this in the same situation. Other people would feel just like me. In fact, there are probably many people in the world right now who feel just like me. They feel just like this. I am not alone, even though I may feel alone in this problem. So just allowing that insight to settle within you that you are connected to others, even connected to others in the feeling of being alone with this problem. Others feel just like me. Just like me. So that's common humanity. That's the second part of self-compassion. And then the third part is self-kindness. So I'd like you to imagine that you had a friend who had exactly the same problem. Exactly the same problem. And you have just a minute with that person, and you want to say a few words from your heart to heart, flowing directly from your heart, a few words to your friend who is struggling in this way. What would you say? You know, maybe you would say something like, I love you, I'm here for you, I'm so sorry you're going through this. I know you can do it. Please be strong, you are strong. What would you say to your friend? Okay, and now what I would like you to do, if you don't mind, is to take your hand and put your hand on your heart. Put your hand over your heart, like this. Put your hand over your heart. And maybe even if you like, two hands over your heart. And just feel the touch of your hand, just feeling the touch and also the warmth of your hand. And now, please begin to say to yourself the same words that you would have said to another person, the same words, the same message that you would give to a friend who was suffering in the same way. Right now, please begin to give yourself the same message, whispering those words into your own ear. And maybe the words don't come in very easily, maybe they bounce off, or maybe they go right in. But just allow yourself for this moment to be bathed in those words, as if you were taking a warm bath, and the warm water does all the work. You don't have to try to do anything. Just surrounding yourself with these words of kindness that you would say to somebody else. Okay, so that's a taste of self-compassion. And this is a skill which can be learned, but just to know that there are three components. Mindfulness, which is knowing when we're struggling. Usually we don't. Usually we're just thinking about it. Second, common humanity. I am not alone, even though it may feel that way. And then third, self-kindness. Having the same attitude and words that you would use with another, using them for yourself. That's the self-compassion break. So I think I've spoken long enough, and I would love to hear from you. What was your experience in that exercise, or any questions about self-compassion? Anything, would love to hear from you.
It was, Chris, it's wonderful. It feels like you spoke only for 1 minute to me. If I may go first, we have a few questions. This practice of self-compassion never ceases to amaze me how human it is. My own mindfulness journey or meditation journey started with one of my teachers in grad school in Toronto, walking us through this practice of loving kindness and self-compassion before starting the lecture.
Oh.
And I remember those days. I would just and he would tell us, David Hunt. He would tell us, you go home, on your way home, you're sitting in the metro, subway. We do this, instead of just looking around, just come in touch with yourself and come in touch with the person in front of you and give yourself some love, recognition, and offer them prayers and loving kindness, positive thoughts. And I remember, this was because this was for me just the crack in the wall. For me, was introduction. And I remember how I was amazed how it was changing my city. The whole city had become a much softer place to live. Citizens, they were much warmer to me. It's just this simple practice of returning to the heart and practicing with intention, practicing this as a skill. So I do have great respect for the practice. And I was reading your book. This is my question. I was reading your book, and you said in your book that within holding oneself in this bubble of kindness is the most difficult thing. Yes. It's even more difficult than holding someone else in that bubble, and I wonder why, is this the degree of separation from ourselves? Is this the depth of our forgetfulness of ourselves? What does that mean? That we cannot, even coming back to ourselves and being kind, we feel weak. We feel, when we start the practice, we feel, this is not for me. Why are we like that? That's my question.
Well, that's a profound question for which there are so many different answers. I would like to give a superficial answer and then maybe a profound answer. Actually, a profound answer that comes from Hafez. The superficial answer is it's very hard to do for ourselves because the culture says that kindness toward ourselves is selfish. In other words, that compassion is both inner and outer, and only outer compassion is right, is legitimate, is okay. The problem is we cannot sustain compassion for others if we don't have compassion for ourselves. That's one reason. Another reason is that usually our nervous system is in a threat state and not in a care state. And what self-compassion does is it shifts the physiology from threat to care. So when you are kind to yourselves and you are kind to others, but especially starting with kindness to yourself, you're actually moving your physiology, as Paul Gilbert in the United Kingdom would say, from threat to care. But it's not possible to be kind to ourselves in a sustained way if we are in a threat state. So we have to figure out how to move from threat to care. But now comes the deep part, and this is the Hafez part. Hafez, loosely translated in English by a guy named Daniel Ladinsky, very loosely translated, wrote, admit something. Everyone you meet, you say to them, love me. Everyone you meet, you say to them, love me. Of course, you don't do this out loud because someone will call the police. But think about it, this great pull in us to connect. Hafez says, why not live with a full moon in each eye that is always saying with that sweet moon language what every other eye in this world is dying to hear? So he says, admit something. Everyone you meet, you say to them, love me. And it's kind of true. Like if you ask yourself, would it be nice if I were less approval seeking? If I could let go of the wish to be approved of? Just about everybody in the world would like to be less approval seeking, but it will never work because from birth, we have needed to be loved in order to survive. We have wanted to be loved until the day we die as human beings, we want to be loved. But we have forgotten. This is the deep part. We have forgotten. And the reason we've forgotten is because it hasn't worked, because our parents and the culture have said, this is good, that is bad, this is good, this is bad, this is good. And at some point, we forgot that we wish to be loved with everyone we meet. And when we don't realize that we wish to be loved, we won't see in others that they wish to be loved. And when we cannot see in ourselves and in others this wish to be loved, the heart remains closed. We are in a state of fear. But imagine what it would be like if you woke up in the morning and you knew throughout this whole day, just as all beings wish to be loved, so do I wish to be loved. Imagine if you remember Hafez's words. When you go out in the street, you will see in everybody's eye the wish to be loved. And what would happen in your heart, in all of our hearts would be soft. We would feel care, we would feel kindness, and we would not be so afraid, and we would not feel so alone. So having forgotten this thing, which Hafez reminded us of, is, in my view, an insight and a foundation for living our lives in a way in which compassion for ourselves and compassion for others becomes very easy.
So we are actually practicing something that we have forgotten. We are practicing to remember. To remember
our loveliness, to remember our beauty and our wish to be welcomed into this world again and again, as we are. We will not be...
Yes. I was wondering, because I do get from people saying that it feels so, and I want you to comment on that. It says, this morning I was leading one session with some people, they were saying it feels sometimes very artificial, but that is okay, no? I mean, this putting intention in remembering, that is okay. We are cultivating a skill.
Yeah. In the beginning, it feels artificial. When we start to ride a bike, it feels artificial.
Yeah.
But eventually we can ride a bike very nicely. But the idea is, if it feels artificial, then maybe it is not real. And that's not correct, actually. Some things that are very true feel like fantasy, you know? Like when people thought that the earth was flat, that seemed true. But then when we hear the earth is round, that's a fantasy. But actually, no, that's more true. Same with love. Same with universal love, same with self-compassion. It's the most natural thing in the world. The most natural thing in the world. What we're learning to do with self-compassion is to remove the obstacles to compassion. And when we remove the obstacles, the natural compassion will flow. This is a path of least resistance. We're learning to give up the resistance to compassion. Compassion for ourselves and compassion for others.
Yes. Wonderful. That removing the barriers to love, Chris, bring me to one of the questions. Somebody asked a question, emailed me a question, and he says, in your work, this is a question to you, in your work, you quote Rumi a lot, apparently. And he has written a lot. He's saying that Rumi has said on this path, what you need to do is to remove barriers in loving and being love. So he says, can you please tell me, I'd like to know, in deepening your understanding of compassion and self-compassion, how much has Rumi, how much have you been inspired by Rumi?
Oh.
He wants to see the connection between Rumi and self-compassion. It's from Iran.
When you mention Rumi, it brings tears to my eyes. Because Rumi knows the path of love, and he has found language for it. Rumi right now is the poet who is read the most in the United States. More than any English poet, more than American poet, Rumi is the most read poet. Rumi understands the path of love, and he understands the path of love without limitation, without ideology, without dogma. He understands. And this compassion and self-compassion is the path of love. Only it's packaged in scientific language, and it's in 8 sessions. 8 sessions, scientific language, very digestible for people in the modern world.
That's genius of itself too. I mean, giving something to people, making such a thing more accessible to people. I mean, that's what I love about self-compassion is bringing a centuries-old wisdom into the academia, into the business world, into everywhere. I mean, this is
it's a scientific excuse for love practice.
Love that excuse. Okay. There's another question. It says, Fahima, she's asking you, say, how can self-compassion heal a broken heart in a relationship? How can we use it with our clients? Apparently, she's a psychotherapist. She says, how can we use self-compassion? How can we use it with our clients suffering from feeling unwanted and rejected in a love relationship? Ended love relationship.
Yes. So that's kind of, there are 2 questions there. One is, how do we integrate this into psychotherapy or counseling? And the other is, how does it heal a broken heart?
Yes.
So I'll try to answer the first one. So the way to integrate self-compassion into counseling is on 3 levels. The first level is the personal embodiment of compassion and self-compassion by the counselor. The second level is having a compassionate conversation, which literally means radical acceptance of the client as they are, with their suffering, with their grief, with their self-doubt, with the broken heart. Radical acceptance, that's the relationship level. And then the third level is practices, like the self-compassion break we did, like meditation. And, so in other words, clients can practice self-compassion for themselves. But the most important thing is the embodiment of the counselor, because sometimes somebody just wants to be held, wants to be loved, wants to be appreciated before they can even begin to think. In other words, sometimes warmth is necessary before we have space to solve our problems. Warmth creates space, space creates warmth. Sometimes we need the warmth in order to begin to open to what's going on in our lives. So the most important obligation for a counselor is to bring this radical acceptance, this loving kindness, compassion to the person who is suffering. And that cannot be underestimated. Sometimes therapists feel that the client is suffering too much, or it hurts the therapist too much, that the client is suffering. Then we want to kind of stop it by throwing self-compassion exercises at the person to make it go away. This is not compassionate. It's not self-compassion. Most important thing is embodiment and relationship. And then when the client feels ready and willing and wants to practice for themselves, then they can do that. And when they do practice for themselves, they actually are giving themselves the hands that are reaching out to the world for to have the needs met, you know, the need to be seen, the need to be heard, the need to be connected, the need to be loved. These hands that are reaching out can actually return toward ourselves, and we can give ourselves precisely those things that we think we cannot live without from others. This is the great revelation or epiphany of self-compassion, that our unmet needs, and that we have many with other people, we can meet a lot of those needs ourselves when we discover the practice of self-compassion. We can give ourselves the love that we might have been desperately seeking for 5 months, 5 years, or 50 years. And when people discover that, self-compassion becomes a part of their lives for the rest of their lives. This is amazing. This is like gold right underneath our noses that we have not yet seen. And usually it's a broken heart that makes us see it for the first time. And that's a silver lining. Sometimes suffering can actually teach us about self-compassion. And as a therapist, we want to go slow. We want to invite a person into self-compassion, but we want to do it through our compassion.
Awesome. A technical question I have. He asks, why don't we, I'm still digesting what you were saying. So, yeah. Why don't we use much body work in mindfulness-based self-compassion as we do in, I think what he means is yoga, mindful yoga. Why don't we use that in self-compassion as much as we do in MBSR?
I think
in the curriculum.
Yeah, I think it would be good to have more body awareness practice in the MSc program. By the way, it's mindful self-compassion, although it could
mindful self-compassion. Yes.
It could be called mindfulness-based self-compassion. Same thing. It's mindfulness-based.
Yes.
But yeah, I think it would be really good to have more yoga and body awareness in the MSc program. But we are already doing so much that to also teach yoga practices and so forth, we've just made some decisions, you know. But what I think is really important to know is that programs like MSc and MBSR and MBCT and MBCL and CCT and all these CBCT, all these 8-week programs, they're only 8 weeks. Yeah. 8 weeks is nothing. So in answer to the question, the foundation of self-compassion is to have a compassionate relationship to one's own experience, which often is one's bodily experience. And for some people, that is the most important part. And if that's so, then definitely the person should practice more body awareness, body kindness. And there are quite a few people actually working in that area now on self-compassion for the body. There's a brand new book just came out on self-compassion for eating disorders, how to have a new respectful, affectionate relationship to the body as a foundation for feeding ourselves properly. So that work will build on. Yeah.
Great. Do you have time for one more question, Chris?
I have time, but we have a lot of people on the call who, I think we have 7 more minutes according to
Yes, we can shoot one more. There's a question, what is the difference between self-compassion and self-confidence? And doesn't self-compassion lead to being careless about others? I mean, I think you touched upon that, but yeah, the question is if we are thinking of ourselves.
I think
Yes.
that there are a lot of important issues in that question. So self-confidence often is related to a person's sense of self-worth. And our sense of self-worth can come from two main sources. Typically, our self-worth comes from how we compare ourselves to others. So if I am a good student in school, then I have high self-worth. But if the same person who is a good student in school is very bad in sports, then they have low self-worth. So our self-worth is often depending on our external circumstances and how we compare to others. So that's what's called contingent self-worth, or based on social comparison. But there's another kind of self-worth, and that comes from kindness. And so when I suffer or fail, if I can respond with kindness, I develop self-worth through love. And this is more stable, it's more resilient, and you can take it with you everywhere. So self-worth, that is depends on social comparison, is very fragile. Self-worth that is based on self-kindness and self-compassion is stable. And when we have this kind of self-worth, when we have self-worth based on self-kindness, we actually are kinder to others. When we have self-worth based on comparison to others, we do some very nasty things, which is we bully people who are below us, and we become delusional about how great we are. In other words, when we are completely dependent on external comparisons, we are actually unkind to other people and delusional about our own worth because our self depends on it. But when our self-worth comes from kindness to ourselves, that kindness will naturally radiate out to other people. And this is what the research shows. The research shows that people who are high in self-compassion are actually more compassionate toward others. Actually, when you ask the partners of people who are high in self-compassion versus the partners of people who are low in self-compassion, what is your partner like? They say that the self-compassionate people are more compassionate, but they're also less aggressive. They're more likely to collaborate and to compromise, and are generally kinder in relationship. People who are high in self-compassion are kinder in relationship. So what that means is, if there's anybody on this call who is looking for a partner, doesn't yet have a partner, and what they can do is go on Kristen Neff's website. When you might meet somebody for coffee, then you send them to Kristen Neff's website. They take the compassion scale, self-compassion scale. You see what their score is. And if they score very high, then you can have a second cup of coffee. Otherwise, waste of time. Just kidding. The reason I mean, it's just a joke, obviously, but everybody has hope. That is to say, we know that everybody, no matter how damaged we are as people from childhood or whatever, can learn self-compassion. This is the good news. We can all learn it.
Yes, great. Okay, I'd like to rephrase the last question. The question is really, how different is self-compassion from mindfulness? I like to rephrase it in saying, where do they meet? What's the relationship between them, rather than the difference between them?
Yeah, thank you. So I consider self-compassion and mindfulness BFF, best friends forever.
Yeah.
Best friends forever. And when mindfulness is in full bloom, when we are truly mindful, we are also truly full of loving kindness, full of compassion, full of self-compassion. That's when mindfulness is in full bloom. But often our mindfulness is not in full bloom. It's tainted by wishing that things were other than they are. It's tainted by avoidance. It's tainted by grasping. It's tainted by confusion. When we say I'm mindful, usually we're only a little mindful. Usually our mindfulness is incomplete because of difficult emotions. When that happens, and we would like to increase our mindfulness, we often need to actively and on purpose bring in compassion training. So what we like to, and this is how it works, what we like to say is, so again, when mindfulness is in full bloom, it's full of compassion. We like to say that actually self-compassion is the beating heart of mindfulness. It's the emotion or the attitude of mindfulness, is the beating heart of mindfulness. But if you want to pull it apart and say, well, what are some of the technical differences? What we like to say is mindfulness is about loving awareness of moment-to-moment experience, and compassion is loving awareness of the experiencer, of the person. So usually in the mindfulness tradition and the wisdom tradition, we're breaking things down into moment-to-moment awareness. But sometimes we can't. And when we can't, we have to and we can't because the sense of self or the observer is under attack. And when that's the case, then we need to bring a lot of love and kindness to the observer. And so, for example, you can't be compassionate toward anger or despair. You can only be compassionate toward a person who is suffering from anger and despair. So what self-compassion is holding the person. So in a nutshell, what we say is sometimes we need to hold ourselves before we can hold our experience. And this is how self-compassion is integrated into mindfulness practice.
Great. And last, Chris, you know, in my experience with mindfulness, teaching mindfulness, is people more and more complain of not having time for the practice. So I usually give them hints in ways of soft ways of bringing mindfulness into their life without it becoming another load, another cross to carry. You know, things like, you know, just a question of yourself, how am I feeling? You know, that kind of thing. And just 10 seconds and move on. Can you give us some micro self-compassion drills for people who really don't have time, seemingly?
Yes, 3 micro practices. The first is to ask yourself in a kind way, what do I need? Mm-hmm. What do I need to comfort, soothe, validate, protect, provide, motivate? What do I need? Mm-hmm. That's number 1. And then number 2, throughout the world, across cultures, compassion is actually directly experienced through soothing touch and gentle vocalizations. So soothing touch means, for self-compassion, to find if there is some way that a simple physical touch to the body, somewhere on your face or your heart, or maybe giving yourself a hug, to explore your own body, what single simple physical gesture actually gives you the direct sense of being comforted and soothed, so that you go, ah. So that's soothing touch. So one micro practice is to find for yourself soothing touch. And to do that when you're in a moment of struggle. And the second is gentle vocalizations. So what we like to say is that the sound of mindfulness is,
Yes.
you know, and if you're in a moment of struggle and you just offer yourself a simple, you discover the power of mindfulness. Now, compassion also has soothing vocalizations. So, for example, if you had a little dog, a little puppy that was trying to go up some stairs, and then it, you know, went up a stair, and then went up another stair, and then it rolled down, and you were watching, you would probably say, "Aw," you know.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, compassion has the sound when it's cute of like, "Aw." But if it's not cute, but you're really drawn with tenderness, you might say, "Oh." Or if you're struck by the enormity of the situation with an open heart, you might say, "Ah." So those sounds like, "Ah," "Oh," "Whoa," "Ah," those sounds are the sounds of self-compassion. You know?
Yes.
So soothing touch, tender vocalizations, or asking yourself, what do I need? Those are micro practices which anybody can do. At first, they might feel artificial, but what we say, fake it till you make it. First, imitation, then realization.
Yeah, it reminds me of a line by a poet saying, let the soft body of yours love what it loves. Something in that line.
You only have to let the soft animal of your body.
Animal of your body loves what it loves.
Yeah. That's self-compassion. She goes on to say, you do not have to walk through the desert for 100 miles repenting.
Yeah.
You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk through the desert for 100 miles repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body. And the key word there, in my view, is let. You only have to let the soft animal of your body. Because when we're in a state of fear, we don't let anything. Huh? Mm-hmm. Give ourselves permission. The body knows, the heart knows, the mind knows, and then all we have to do is say yes, and we will be healed.
Yes. Thank you. It's so humanizing, this self-compassion practice, returning to our humanness, I think. And as I was saying, to me, it feels like a very integral part of a mindfulness practice. It's just you come in touch with your humanness. Now, what are you going to do about it? You embrace it slowly.
Yeah, best friends forever, mindfulness and compassion.
Yes, yes.
Best friends forever.
Yes.
They'll always be best friends. They will always be best friends. We may have opinions about this, but mindfulness and compassion have no opinions about this. They're best friends.
Yeah, they are best friends. Having a good time.
Having a good time.
Thank you, Chris. We had a wonderful time with you, illuminating and delightful time with you.
Thank you. It's just beautiful that you gave me this opportunity, and I hope it is helpful.
Yes, no, I can feel opening doors for many, and we will translate these recordings into Farsi for those of us who do not speak English or understand English, and to reach out for a wider community, wider audience in future. Thank you so much. Thank you for making this possible. And I want to thank everyone on this session for the presence, for the questions, and for being and joining us. And wishing you the best, Chris. And
thank you. Thank you.
One day we will have you in Iran again after 40 years.
I would love to return physically to Iran. We just have to talk about our political issues.
Yes,
for
we
which I
work on it.
For which I feel much sadness. Yes.
Yes, yes. Thank you. With this, we will end the session, and looking forward to meet you again. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Manish. Thank you, Chaddu. Bye-bye.
Bye.